Hello, my name is Julie Dixon. I'm a specialist children's learning disability nurse and a Build accredited positive behaviour support coach. I work in Manchester's virtual mental health team for children with disabilities who are currently living in local authority care. This video talks through the STAR approach and how it's a helpful way to understand the function or functions of a particular challenging behaviour. The STAR stands for setting, trigger, action and result, and it is an approach which is in line with the principles of positive behaviour support. Thank you.
It's important to try and understand the behaviour and why it's happening, also what's keeping the behaviour going. And if we can understand the behaviour, this puts us in a better position to be able to work out which strategies can be used to reduce and change those challenging behaviours. All behaviour happens for a reason. There is always a purpose or a function to that behaviour. Positive behaviour support does not accept that behaviour occurs out of the blue, as it were. Every challenging or difficult behaviour occurs because of the interaction between a person's internal state, their environment and other people. The internal states include the biological state of the person, so the person expressing this through challenging behaviour may be in pain, or they may be hungry or tired, or they may be hormonal, struggling with something like PMT, or they may be experiencing some discomfort, perhaps if not painful, uncomfortable. If it's chronic, maybe something like toothache or perhaps constipation. There is also the internal emotional state as well, which needs to be considered in relation to mood, whether the young person is feeling quite bored or angry or stressed or anxious about something. Behaviour which is repeated is often seen as meeting the individual's needs in some way. So challenging behaviour always happens for a reason, and there are four main functions of behaviour. The first being to escape or avoid something that the young person doesn't like or that they want to stop. The second one is to gain something that the young person may want or need. The third one is to gain a social interaction or some attention or reassurance, something that we all need as human beings. And the fourth being to perhaps get some stimulation or enjoyment if feeling a little bit bored. This is often seen in sensory type behaviours, which can be quite repetitive. And there is also self-injurious behaviour to consider here as well. Often if self-injurious behaviour is expressed, it can be a way of reducing the physical or psychological pain that's being felt internally. Our task really is to understand the function of the behaviour and the purpose that it serves for the young person, so that we can help them to get their needs met in a more positive way. And this does require a whole team approach. It cannot really just be one person in isolation trying to work out the functions and the purpose of behaviour. We really need everybody on board working together so that we can make sure that things are consistent for the young person and everyone in their support network. To understand behaviour, there is a useful tool known as the STAR, and it's an approach to understanding behaviour that's quite similar to other approaches that people may be familiar. For example, the ABC charts, which look at antecedents, behaviour and consequence. In the STAR approach, we use the S, T, A and R, and it really helps us to understand the reasons underlying that behaviour, again, so that we can help the young people, the young person, to communicate these needs in a more appropriate way. The settings, triggers, actions and results give us an extra dimension, if you like, with the settings, so that we can really understand what's happening in the context of that particular behaviour. So the settings, the setting tells us more about the context, and it helps us to think about what's going on in the environment around that young person at the time of the behaviour. So we're thinking about the physical environment, who was there, which people were around, what was the activity that the young person was doing at the time, where were they, what time of day was it, what exactly was happening with the activity, was there any change to what was expected, the kind of things that may impact on the young person quite immediately, as well as things that may have been building up throughout the morning before, or the night before, if the young person hasn't slept well and then had a difficult morning at school on a hot, warm day, perhaps, and then coming home and something has changed on the bus on the way home, and it can build up to a point where the young person's tolerance can be very low and easily triggered. There's also the personal elements of the settings to consider as well. What was the person's physical well-being like at the time? Again, were they quite anxious? Were they hungry? Was there any pain? Was there any sensory regulation problems? You know, have they been having to sit for much longer perhaps than they would normally be able to? It's trying to sort of really unpick and understand what's happening in the setting for that young person. And then we have the triggers, and the triggers are absolutely what occurs just before, immediately before the behaviour happens. For instance, if the person's been asked to do something and might feel that demand is being placed on them, or if something suddenly happens, like the fire alarm suddenly going off unexpectedly, or maybe something that they perhaps expect but want more control over. For example, the games console being turned off suddenly. So it's really important if we can get as much information as possible when we think about settings and triggers, because it's at this stage that we can make lots of changes. We can make environmental changes, or we can remove triggers when we're thinking about how we might be able to prevent and change behaviours in the future. Okay, actions. When we think about the actions, that's exactly what we saw when the behaviour happened. What did the young person do? You must be able to see or hear an action, for example, hitting, screaming, spitting, running off. And we also need to be able to count that action so that we can monitor behaviour and work out if it's getting less, and if the strategies we're putting in place are reducing that particular behaviour. And it's good to be as descriptive as possible, really, because if we were to say the person had a meltdown, then one person's meltdown would be very different to another's. So we need to be really specific about the actual actions that we saw. And then the results of the behaviour are also really important, because it's the results of the behaviour that can perhaps shape the behaviour and keep that behaviour going. So the results might include things like how other people responded to the behaviour, those around the young person or in the young person's environment. Were they shouting at the young person? Were they laughing at the young person? What kind of attention was the young person being given as a response? Or did they get something that they wanted? Did they get that extra sweet that they wanted, or that extra ice cream, or that particular thing that they wanted that somebody else had? Or did they manage to avoid something or make something stop? You know, if they were feeling a bit lonely, did they get somebody to be with them so that they didn't feel perhaps as lonely and alone? So when we think about the R of the star, it tells us how behaviour is perhaps being shaped and made more or less likely to happen again in the future. Behaviour is often learned and shaped, and it's the events that follow a behaviour that make it more or less likely to happen again. Positive reinforcement, negative reinforcement, and punishment are known as operant conditioning. And positive reinforcement is when something good happens, something nice happens after the behaviour, or something we want happens after the behaviour, And this makes it more likely that we will use that behaviour again to get that thing that we want. Negative reinforcement is when something stops that we didn't want to happen, or we avoided something that we didn't want to happen. And that makes it more likely that we'll use that behaviour again if we want something to stop or to avoid something that we don't like. And then finally, punishment. Punishment is when something that is unpleasant happens to us after the behaviour, and makes it less likely that we will use that behaviour again. But it's important to stress that punishment on its own is not a good behaviour management strategy. If we were to use punishment to make it less likely that the behaviour happens again, what is likely to happen is there is likely to be another behaviour that's used to meet that same need. Because with punishment, we're not supporting the young person develop a new skill or find a new way of getting that need met. So punishment is not something that we advocate as part of shaping up the behaviours that we want to see, and reduce the behaviours that we don't want to see. There will be some further information about positive reinforcement, negative reinforcement and punishment in relation to operant conditioning in the information packs that we'll be sending out, and that's something you can look at, and there's a quiz as well also that you can perhaps have a go at as a team to check your understanding of positive reinforcement, negative reinforcement, punishment.